Good morning to everyone. This is a lecture that I have given a few days ago to a private group, and I decided that maybe a wider audience will be interested in it. The subject of this lecture are the Jews of the Ottoman Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries. It was a rather difficult mission to squeeze 200 years in an hour or so, but eventually I think that I've been able to portray a general picture that will serve many of the audience to get an idea of the existence and experience of the Jewish communities in the Ottoman Empire at that period. Let me start with the various colors and shapes of the people who are the core of my talk today. The 16th century, and to be more precise, the years following 1492, were the years at which the Jewish Ottoman society had been formed. At the end of that century, Ottoman Jewry comprised immigrants from the Catholic world and members of indigenous communities which the Ottomans inherited together with the countries they conquered. Some of these countries were Muslim and others were Greek Orthodox. The indigenous Jewish communities of the Muslim countries usually spoke Arabic, while those of the Greek Orthodox world usually spoke Greek. The members of the immigrant communities that grew up in the empire from 1492 onwards usually spoke a Castilian dialect of Spanish, but also dialects of southern Italy and Sicily, as well as Portuguese. The influx of refugees from Christian Europe was not homogeneous in motives and character. It had started with the expulsion from Spain in 1492. Many of the expellees headed toward the Ottoman Empire, while approximately 100,000 people crossed the border between Spain and Portugal and settled in Portugal. Since the expellees had a choice between converting to Christianity or leaving Spain without their belongings, their emigration was a clear indication of a common characteristic, an adherence to Judaism. The first expellees appeared at the Ottoman shores at the end of the summer of 1492. Others arrived later after interim stops in Italy and North Africa. They were followed by their brethren from southern Italy and Sicily who were expelled a short while afterwards. All suffered cruel experiences on the way. In 1497, Portugal began a forced conversion of Jews without giving them the option of emigration. Presumably, those 100,000 Jews who had arrived from Spain 5 years earlier had no intention of changing their religion. We might assume that among the Portuguese Jews there were others who did not have such an intention. Some of these people managed to escape and reach the Ottoman Empire in a second wave of immigration from the Iberian Peninsula. Those who stayed in Portugal created a community of new Christians under duress. They looked for an opportunity to move to a place where they could practice their Judaism openly. In 1506, after riots in Lisbon against the new Christians, They were given permission to travel outside the country, and many of them took advantage of this opportunity to live for places outside the Christian world, with the Ottoman Empire being one of the most important destinations. And the flow of immigration from the Iberian Peninsula to the Ottoman lands surged again. In 1521, the grace period given to the new Christians in Portugal ended. Those who did not use this grace period to leave the country were now regarded by many of their brethren in the Ottoman lands as having accepted their Christianity, not only de jure and de facto, but also emotionally. Apparently, therefore, the Iberian immigrants to the Ottoman Empire between 1492 and 1521 should be regarded as people motivated by strong religious feelings more than anything else. Anybody who migrated later on, his motives should be questioned. Another wave of immigration from Portugal reached Istanbul between 1536 and 1560. Large numbers of new Christians had been considering the possibility of leading a double life or even leaving the Jewish fold altogether, not only from the outward, but also from the real inward point of view. But the start of a national inquisition in Portugal in 1536 convinced many that this would not be possible, because the Inquisition followed the steps and inquired the activities of all new Christians, not only those who were suspected of not being loyal to their new faith. So these Portuguese new Christians who felt that they cannot stay in Portugal emigrated to Christian lands where they lingered for several years before ending up at the Ottoman Empire. Their motives were not necessarily allegiance to Judaism. The Inquisition persecuted them on racial as well as religious grounds. Consequently, many of them left the Iberian Peninsula not in order to live openly as Jews, but to escape this constant harassment, as I noted before. They came to the Ottoman lands after decades of living as Christians, imbued with the culture of Christian Europe and having strong ties to their former cultural, economic, and political world. All of them left families and friends behind in what is called in Hebrew the world of idolatry. From the last quarter of the 16th century, the flow of Jewish refugees from Catholic Europe to the Ottoman Empire came to a virtual standstill. This was because the pool of new Christians in Spain and Portugal, who still wished to live in a Jewish place, as they called it, had dried up. Another reason was the rise in international trade, which led various Catholic countries to suffer the presence of the new Christians who secretly observed or openly reverted to their former Jewish religion for their commercial contribution. In certain places, such as Livorno, in 1593, such Jews were given rights very similar to those granted to their fellow Christians. In the late 17th century came the last wave of immigrants to the Ottoman lands from these very communities of new Christians who returned to the Jewish fold in Christian principalities who agreed to tolerate them. This was a Jewish immigration of another kind. The new immigrants were not refugees. They were not refugees looking for a safe haven. They were Jews who held on to the nationality of their Catholic countries of origin, those countries who had given them privileges, and who settled in the Ottoman Empire for economic reasons. These were placed under the protection of French consulates and later other European consulates. They were called by the local Jews Francos. They were absolved from paying taxes to the Ottoman authorities as well as taxes to the Jewish communities. They were called Francos because of their place of origin, Francia or Frangistan in Turkish, the lands of the Franks. Although numerically small, in the course of time, they became extremely influential in Jewish society. These Jews spoke Portuguese and Italian. From the early 18th century to the 1880s, the stream of Jews from the lands of Christendom to the Ottoman Empire dried up completely. How did the Ottoman state view the existence of Jews in its land? The Ottoman state was first and foremost a Muslim state. It therefore believed in the supremacy of Islam and of Muslims over other religions and their adherents. Indeed, the protection that Muslim rulers extended to members of monotheistic denominations, the Zimet, was contingent on the recognition of the supremacy of the Muslim faith. As a Muslim state, the empire allowed Jews and members of other religions to conduct their internal affairs as they saw fit. Since Islam was primarily the law of Muslims, the Muslim ruler did not intervene in the affairs of non-Muslims, except when absolutely necessary. Absolutely necessary when one of his subjects called for such intervention. The Ottoman Empire extended its protection to all its non-Muslim monotheistic subjects inside and outside its borders, as long as they were obedient and submissive. They were considered zimmis, people under the protection of Islam. The empire considered it a given that all state resources, human or otherwise, were the Sultan's property. Likewise, obedience to the Sultan, the supremacy of the askeri, the military administrative cadre, and the supremacy of the Muslim judicature over the re'aya, that is, the simple taxpayers, is irrespective of denomination, were taken for granted. The use of Turkish as the language of government was taken for granted as well. The other side of the coin, however, was that the Sultan considered himself obliged to rule all his subjects, including Jews, justly and see to their needs. This meant that while the Jews of the empire, as dhimmis, could never be askeri, since this implied dominion over Muslims, all other occupations were open to them. This was very different than what was the rule in the Christian world. In their dealings with the institutions of government, Jews had to use Turkish, but in their day-to-day lives they continued to speak Judeo-Spanish or Arabic, or to a lesser extent Greek and Aramaic, but almost never Turkish. Within these parameters, the Jewish community led a peaceful existence, with the government intervening only when called upon to do so, as I said, by one of its subjects. During the 16th century, wealthy Jews from the lands of Christendom, people such as Moshe and Yosef Hamon, Don Yosef Nasi, Don Shlomo ibn Yaish, the Soncino family, and others, achieved wealth and political influence that transcended their zimmi status. But this phenomenon diminished during the 17th century and ceased altogether in the course of the 18th century. Unlike their predecessors, the Jewish plutocrats of the second half of the 17th century did not engage in international commerce or intervene in the empire's European foreign policy, but were holders of various government monopolies. They were court bankers, sarafs, provisioners of various army regiments, and managers of affairs of the askeri top brass. They were not ostentatious, their homes looking very simple from the outside, not from the inside, and unlike their predecessors, they were very careful not to infringe upon the restrictions placed upon them as members of an inferior faith. Those who failed to do so paid not only with their property, with their possessions, but also with their lives. How did the Jews relate to the Ottoman state? The Sultan's authority and the importance of the Ottoman Empire in the life of its Jewish subjects were perceived in the 16th and 17th centuries as an incontrovertible fact. The duty of loyalty and obedience was accepted unquestioningly by the Jews, both because it was the key to their survival and because obedience to the state and its rulers became closely bound up with obedience to the community's economic elite. Since this elite was closely connected with the askeri class, it was eager to cultivate obedience and loyalty to the Ottoman state. How did the Jews saw themselves vis-à-vis the ambient society? The Ottoman state's acceptance of the right of the others to be different fostered diversity. The result was that throughout the centuries under discussion, Jewish society, like other religious and ethnic groups in the empire, was subjected to two opposing forces. One force tended toward reinforcement of individuality and diversity, while the other tended toward cultural assimilation. On the other hand, everyday life worked toward the creation of a common cultural infrastructure, even if no one was prepared to admit it. On the other hand, Jewish society was allowed to foster its individuality and maintain its own religion and language. The ambient society, whether Muslim or Greek, was not necessarily perceived as dangerous or hostile, but as alien and apart. Excessive involvement in the ambient society was frowned upon as reflecting low moral standards. This was particularly true of the middle classes, especially in relation to women. A Jewish woman who spoke Turkish was assumed to be mixing in the wrong circles. The distinction between the haremlik, or the private section of the house, and the selamlik, the public section, was adopted willingly by the Jewish society and was a cornerstone in the Jews' attitude toward the ambient society. The wish to protect women and young children of an impressionable age from external influence made it possible for generations of Jews in the Ottoman lands to reinforce their linguistic and cultural distinctiveness. On the other hand, this same tolerance of difference made it extremely difficult to maintain an absolute separation between Jewish society and the ambient society. Some traits of assimilation of Ottoman culture were common to great parts of the empire. The impression of Turkish music, decorative arts, fashioning dress and furniture was widespread. On the other hand, in Istanbul, the Jewish-Turkish acculturation was expressed also in the opposite direction, especially in one field, the performing arts. Jews took an active part and an important role in all branches of performing arts, and their influence is to be traced especially in the Karagöz plays. The bilateral influences between Jewish and Muslim circles of mystics should also be taken into account. The degree of separation and assimilation of tastes and mores varied from place to place. In Salonika, for example, where Jews formed the largest religious group, a Jew could live his entire life without having to exchange more than a few sentences in a language different than Judeo-Spanish. This fact was significant not only in cultural linguistic terms, but also in terms of self-definition. A Jewish inhabitant of Salonika considered himself first and foremost a Salonican. Only in a second place he was an Ottoman Jew, Ottoman or whatever. He was a Salonican. If he related to anyone from another religion, it was to the members of the ruling Muslim Turkophone class only, with whom he had dealings and whose protection he enjoyed. On the other hand, the Istanbuli Jew had a different attitude toward the ambient society. Since Jews formed a tiny minority of the capital's enormous population, and since the city's economy revolved to a large extent around the royal court, the Jewish community there was far more enmeshed with the ambient Muslim society than in any other place in the empire. It was far more interested in the fate of the empire, the fate of its rulers, than was any other Jewish community in the empire. And the tendency to emulate Muslim society was more pronounced here than elsewhere. This tendency was particularly evident among the Jewish elite, whose life was a downscaled version of that of the Ottoman elite. On the other end of the social spectrum were boatmen, fishermen, owners of tavernas, and other marginal groups. They were also more involved with the Gentile society. In general, Istanbul Jewish society spoke more Turkish than any other Jewish community in the empire, although here too the vast majority of Jews spoke Judeo-Spanish among themselves, and to a much lesser degree Greek. Greek disappeared altogether during the 18th century. Jews who lived in the provincial towns of the empire were also forced to relate more to the Gentile society. Jews, as a very small percentage of the population in medium and small towns, were forced into constant contact with the ambient society, and this left its mark. This mark varied according to the ambient society. Slavic if the ambient society was Slavic, Greek if the ambient society spoke Greek. This sheds light on the Judeo-Spanish saying, the provincial Jew is a half-Christian, Catholico medio Cristianico. In Izmir, the city of infidels, home to many Greeks and Christian foreigners, Jewish life was very much affected by ties with Christian Europe and the ambient Christian society. These developments found expression in geographical variations in the Judeo-Spanish vernacular. In Arab-speaking countries, the language incorporated Arabic words, while in Bulgaria, Serbia, and Bosnia, it incorporated Slavic words. The Judeo-Spanish spoken in Istanbul had far more Turkish words than did the Judeo-Spanish spoken in Salonika. How did the ambient society view the Jews? Since the society in which the Jews of the empire lived was so heterogeneous, it is impossible to speak of a uniform attitude toward the Jews. Moreover, the attitude toward Jews was not governed solely by religious factors, but also by ethnic and class factors. Within Turcophone Muslim society, Jews as a group were perceived as useful, trustworthy, and loyal to the state. On the other hand, they were portrayed as cowardly and contemptible. The same was true in Arabophone Muslim society, with one exception. Attempts by the local Muslim elite in Ottoman Jerusalem to consolidate its hold on the holy places led it to perceive all non-Muslims, Jews as Christians, as alien, not to say hostile element, whereas the local Ottoman administration regarded them as a legitimate channel for the transfer of funds from the lands of Christendom to its own pockets. Christian society in the empire, irrespective of ethnic affiliation, perceived Jews as a group implanted by the Ottoman conqueror and as the Sultan's loyal servants. Even before the rise of the nationalist movements in the Balkans, this perception was sufficient to single out Jews as the enemies of Christian society in the empire. Since the Muslim superiority was uncontested, Jews were the only sparring partner left. The Orthodox ecclesiastical tradition lent a moral imprimatur to this attitude. Many Greek, Macedonian, and Bulgarian folk songs of this period portrayed the Jews as cunning, avaricious, and miserly, and accused them of abducting young Christian women and children for nefarious purposes. Thus, while the Ottoman Muslims saw Jews as clever, cowardly, and contemptible, the Greek Orthodox saw the Jew as downright evil and dangerous. Let us consider the culture of the empire's Jews. As long as immigration from Europe continued, even if on a tiny scale, Jewish society in the empire underwent a catalyst, no, not a catalyst, it underwent a process of ferment and change. Once the immigration ceased, the drive for change disappeared, and increasingly Jewish society became a microcosm of Ottoman Muslim society, which it attempted to emulate. This development is very common among societies of immigrants. In the first generation after the immigration, the first and the second, and even the third, they contribute a lot to the absorbing society. They contribute by the innovations they are bringing from their places of origin, but that they want to assimilate, and eventually they do assimilate and lose their advantage over the local society. They become like everybody else. In the Ottoman case, the transition from international commerce to local commerce and business with the Ottoman ruling cadres was one symptom of a general process of change that swept through Jewish society in the 17th century. This process was characterized by a tendency toward introversion, acquiescence, and satisfaction with the status quo. For Jews to engage in international trade of any significance, it would have had to study foreign languages and to involve in the politics, cultures, and the economies of foreign countries, all of which ran counter to the socio-cultural ethos that they developed in the course of the 17th century. Such activities were left up to the Francos, who were considered Jews of a second rate, desecrators of the Sabbath and outright heretics. An interesting manifestation of the process of atrophy and apathy was the voluminous sale of ancient manuscripts of the works and translated works of Greek philosophers that had been brought over at tremendous risk from the lands of Christendom at the time of the expulsion. And now they were sold to French diplomats and European merchants and scholars. Not only did the Jews show no interest in these manuscripts, they failed to understand a word of them and their wider significance. Jewish society became extremely materialistic. This process of stagnation left its mark even on religious study and research, which had always been a cornerstone of religious identity. The focus changed from innovative and creative thinking to the study of Kabbalistic and mystical literature, whereas scholars of the first generation after the settlement had focused on Jewish legal literature in an attempt to adapt it to a constantly changing conditions. Toward the end of the second century, research and exegesis came to a standstill. Even the rabbinical response of that period became more and more tedious repetition of former halachic rulings and was totally lacking in innovation and originality. Now I would like to move to the structure of Jewish society. This is a topic to which I could have dedicated many hours, but the time given, I will try to be concise. Throughout the empire's existence, leadership of the Jewish community was vested in a small group of wealthy men whose power derived from their wealth and from their ties with the local or imperial Ottoman administration. This was especially evident in the capital, where for generations the community was led by a small group of families like the Soncino, called in Istanbul Tzoncin, Hamon, Rosanes, Uziel, Veisid, and several others. Later on, in the 18th century, another group of families took their place, Ibn Zonana, Ajiman, and Karamona. In provincial capitals such as Cairo and Damascus, it was the family of the Jewish court banker of the Vali, the Saraf Bashi, who ruled the Jewish community for generations. Despite a certain turnover in the 17th century, community leadership was not elected democratically, but rather through a process of co-option. Participation in political life was restricted to taxpayers only, and those in the highest tax bracket wielded the greatest political clout. Throughout the 17th century, the Jewish communities in large cities such as Istanbul and Salonika underwent changes that reached their apex after the 1700s. One of the most important changes took place at the organizational level. These large communities had evolved in the 16th century from separate congregations originating in Christian Europe or the Balkans. The members of these congregations lived near their synagogues, which served both as a social and religious centers. Each one of them obeyed its leaders, venerated its Chacham, studied Torah under him, suffered his admonishments, and educated their children together, and supported each other in times of trouble. Though this congregational structure helped the expellees and refugees overcome the trauma of displacement, it was very costly. As long as the empire maintained its conquering momentum, Jews also enjoyed the economic benefits of the plunder and loot that flowed into its centers. However, the structural crisis in the empire in the late 16th century and the monetary crisis in the 17th century led the Jews to rationalize their organizational culture. Actually, this process began already in the 16th century, when Ottoman taxation policy forced the Jews to close ranks in order to obtain better terms from the authorities, and in order to decide how best to distribute the tax burden among themselves. The congregations of the large communities were also forced to cooperate in social, welfare, and educational matters. Throughout the empire, education had always been the community's greatest headache, greatest expense. Since not everybody profited from it, it had always been a bone of contention. Educating poor children, who far outnumbered the rich, had always been a big headache for the wealthy, because they financed the community's institutions. They were caught between the wish to cut back on expenditure and the recognition that throughout history, education had always been the key to Jewish survival. Different localities adopted different solutions to this problem. Already in the early 16th century, Sultan Selim I, Yavuz Selim, had awarded the Jews of Istanbul a plot of land in the Eminönü area, where today the Yeni Jami is located, to serve the welfare needs of the city's Jewish population. A three-story building was erected on this plot to accommodate the capital's poor, who were supported by the various congregations. The third story housed a Jewish school for poor children. We see from the above that even if each congregation supported its own poor, they joined forces when the situation called for it. The trend toward organizational centralization, however, was precipitated to an even greater extent by the fires that were a common occurrence in Istanbul in the 16th and 17th centuries. These fires caused Jews from the same background, who were members of the same congregation, who spoke the same language and used the same liturgy, to move to other neighborhoods and congregations where the Jews spoke a different language and had a different historical background and used a different liturgy. After the Yeni Jami was built on the charred remains of the Jewish neighborhood, which was burnt out in 1660, the Jews of the old quarter, who had lived there since the beginning of the Ottoman rule and even before, were forced to move to Haskoy and Balat. With this move, it no more made sense to maintain separate congregations, and with the decline in resources, the abolition of the congregational rabbinical courts and their replacement by district courts and tribunals, this was only a matter of time. By the late 17th century, the organizational pattern of the Jewish community in the capital had crystallized. The autonomous congregations with their separate rabbinical courts were replaced by three large district rabbinical courts: Haskoy, Balat, and Galata. They were governed by a supreme court presided over by a chief rabbi, literally all-encompassing rabbi, Rav HaKolel, who was elected from among the judges of the three quarters. This rabbinical court operated various sub-courts, which existed even before, but now they were under the supervision of this super court. A tribunal dealing with the rights of tenure in immovable assets and in occupations. Another tribunal was the anti-vice tribunal, which deliberated matters of morality. Both of them existed already at the beginning of the 16th century, but now they were under the supervision of the Supreme Court. Another court was the Rituals Tribunal on matters relating to forbidden foods, personal status, and related issues. This one evolved in the 17th century. A similar process took place in Salonika, where in the early 16th century the Jews built an institution called Talmud Torah HaGadol, the Great House of Study, a complex that included a hospital, a mental asylum, a soup kitchen, a hostel, a wool factory cum warehouse, and a school. Unlike its Istanbul counterpart, Salonika's Jewish school catered to all the city's Jewish children, rich and poor alike. Poor children studied there for free, while children of the wealthy paid fees. The poor children also received a set of new clothes every year, paid for by the community. The school taught Torah studies to children aged 4 to 13. The most gifted students graduated to a higher yeshiva located in the same compound, and they went on to become rabbis, judges, and teachers at the same institution and elsewhere in the Ottoman Empire. This complex, which continued to function for several centuries, was remarkable not only as a social enterprise, but also as an antithesis of what the congregations of Salonika has strived to achieve throughout the 16th century, the preservation of their financial and judicial autonomy and sovereignty. The existence of the Talmud Torah Gadol, the Great House of Studies, led to the establishment of a supreme rabbinical court for the Salonika community, in which the rabbis of the various congregations served in turn and presided over by a chief rabbi chosen from among the ranks. The economic decline of Salonika in the 17th and 18th centuries led to the strengthening of the communal judicial institutions at the expense of the congregational ones. All that remained of the congregations was the neighborhood synagogue that served as a place of worship and also a meeting place for debating topics of public interest. It also served as a house of study for paterfamilias after working hours. The centralization of the judicial system was accompanied by centralization of the administrative system in the administrative fiscal system, with the focus passing from the congregation to the community. The leaders of the community, who were also the wealthiest members, were formally elected by the taxpayers and formed an executive body. In effect, as already noted, these leaders were usually co-opted when the leadership cadre dwindled due to death, resignation, or emigration of one of the leaders. By the end of the 17th century, as the economic situation of the Ottoman Jewry deteriorated, and since the internal taxation method was progressive, the rich looked for and found ways to alleviate the burden placed on their shoulders. This was done by several methods. The first one was curtailing the direct taxes collected commensurately to the taxpayers' wealth. The second way was by augmenting the indirect taxes on meat which every Jewish carnivore had to pay, no matter what was his income. These two methods were easy to achieve since the rich were the lawmakers. In a place like Salonika, in which the taxes were very heavy, the burden on the rich resulted in the conversion to Islam of 300 families between 1683 and 1687, claiming that they are converting because their religious shepherd, their Messiah, Shabtai Tzvi, converted too, and the way for salvation went through such conversion. Later, this same result was achieved by the richest Jews of Salonika by buying the protection of European powers, which enabled them to get rid of the communal taxes. I would like to add a few words on the place of the Jews of this period and the empire's economy. At the time of arrival, the Jewish immigrants were considered an economic asset to the empire through the new skills they brought with them and through their economic ties with Christian Europe. Consequently, throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, the Iberian expellees and refugees integrated easily into the economic life of the empire. They practiced a large, wide range of trades and were active in all branches of commerce, including tax farming and government monopolies. The decline of immigration in the mid-16th century, the severance of ties with the lands of Christendom, and the integration of the immigrants' offspring into the socio-economic fabric of the Ottoman Empire did away with the relative advantage enjoyed by the first generations of the immigrants. International trade, the fault of the 16th century immigrants, was taken over by Greeks and Armenians. As Jewish entrepreneurs favored business ties with the Sultan's administration over private initiatives in areas that had become foreign to them. They preferred to be tax farmers, hold government monopolies, or handle the affairs of the ruling class. Implicit in this ideal was the importance of stability and preservation of the status quo. Any diversion from the status quo or innovation was considered forbidden and dangerous territory. Even an adventurous entrepreneur such as Sasot Chai Castiel, the man from Castilia, who spent his whole life traveling to India and Southeast Asia, Burma, Ceylon and such, on business, marketing gems and pearls on an international scale. He sold his merchandise not only in Istanbul but also in Venice, in Livorno, in Amsterdam and in London. He felt at the end of his life that he wasted his life, since his quest for wealth had estranged him from home and heritage and the real purpose of life. And the purpose of life was to continue one's line in a Jewish way of life. A Jewish way of life is a stable way of life, not running around the globe looking for ways to make money. By the mid-17th century, most Jews of the empire worked as petty tradesmen, artisans, hired workers, or retailers. Tax and custom farming was reserved to the economic elite. The only Jews who engaged in international commerce in a big way were the Francos, who controlled a large part of the empire's trade with Italy, some of the trade with France and England, and in the mid-18th century they also began trading with Central Asia and India through Basra. Something should be said about the guild system. The guild system organized the whole economic Ottoman life. During the 16th century, Jewish artisans and merchants consisted part of their professions guild in the city. As time went by, professional specialization on an ethnic basis developed, as the guilds of each religion tried to preserve their monopoly over certain possessions. While the structure and work methods of the Jewish guilds largely resembled those of their Muslim counterparts, from the 17th century, not the beginning, from first quarter of the 17th century onward, there was very little cooperation between the guilds belonging to the different ethnic groups. They were competitors more than anything else. The last topic that I would like to discuss is the family life of Ottoman Jews. During the Ottoman period, the Jewish family adopted many of the values of the Ottoman Muslim family. This process of assimilation was neither hard nor traumatic, since to a certain degree the family values of the both cultures had coincided from the beginning. Thus, assimilation largely involved a shedding of customs adopted in medieval Spain or Italy. The leitmotif of the family in both Muslim and Jewish cultures, since time immemorial, was the preservation of the name and memory of the male branch of the family. In Jewish culture, this theme gave rise to a body of inheritance laws favoring brothers over sisters and even the father's family over that of the mother. An interesting expression of the Jews' assimilation of Ottoman norms of behavior was the readiness with which the Spanish immigrants discarded the amendments to the Jewish law of succession made in Christian Europe regarding the husband's right to inherit his wife's estate if she died childless. This was called the Toledo Regulations. Early customs were rapidly readopted. The Romaniote Jews, on the other hand, influenced by Greek society, continued upholding their own version of the Toledo Regulations. A Jewish woman who turned to a Sharia court in matters of inheritance was likely to get a better deal there than in a rabbinical court. Another consequence was the preference, particularly on the part of the males, for endogamous marriages. The impact of local customs was also visible in the imposition of restrictions on a woman's freedom of movement and contact with members of the opposite sex, a matter concerning which the Spanish expellees had been fairly liberal before the expulsion. These restrictions were the norm in Ottoman high society and fitted in with the Jewish ideal of all glorious is the king's daughter within the palace. The Jewish middle and upper class home, like its Muslim counterpart, as I already mentioned, was divided into the haremlik, where the family lived and which was barred to male visitors other than relatives, and the selamlik, where male visitors were received and which was barred to women at such times. A self-respecting Jewish woman, like her Muslim counterpart, went out only for family visits, ritual immersion, or pilgrimage to a holy site. Even then, she was accompanied by female or male attendants or male relatives. Ordinary women, on the other hand, did not enjoy such privileges. There thus developed a huge divide between the perception of the family by the early expellees and that which had become dominant after 200 years of Jewish existence in the Ottoman Empire. This is apparent from the criticism the rabbis of the empire leveled at the Francos settling in the Ottoman Empire at the end of the 17th century. Two customs that elicited particularly harsh reactions of the rabbis were the custom of the Franco women to walk alone in public and the habit of the Francos to sally forth in the company of their wives and daughters. An Ottoman man would not go out with his female members of the family, but with other male friends. In certain areas, change was unnecessary. In both societies, Jewish as Muslim, juvenile marriage was the norm, particularly for women. 12 years and 6 months was considered an ideal age for girls to get married. This was no doubt also a function of the short lifespan characteristic of the urban centers of that period. Let me conclude. Whereas the 1500s were years of settlement, ferment, and innovation for the Jews of the empire, the 1600s were more Ottoman years. In this period, the integration of the Jewish immigrant society into the ambient culture deepened, and many of the cords that tied it to Christian Europe were severed. By the end of the 17th century, the most prominent remaining link was the Judeo-Spanish language and its literary tradition. Along with religion, language continued to serve as a dividing line between the Jews and the ruling Muslim society, which the former otherwise looked up to and wished to emulate. Yet it was the Jewish society's success in integrating within the Ottoman order that diminished its ability to contribute something new to the ambient society. The loss of this innovative potential was one of the main reasons for the deterioration of the Jewish community's political status in the course of the 18th century and on the eve of the Tanzimat, the reforms in the Ottoman Empire. Thank you so much.